mother tells me that I was literate at about 3 years old, and that's mostly because I didn't want to wait for anybody to read me a story. I wanted to do it myself. I had a library card when I was about 5, and Mom used to take me to the library every Saturday, and I would get all of the books that I was allowed to get. When you're 5, you only are allowed like 4 books because they don't think you can read any more than that in a week, and I always did. I still do. So I grew up steeped in story, and I knew that I wanted to be a storyteller. But I grew up in a very hard-working, blue-collar family. Neither of my parents even finished high school. And the thought that you could make a living telling stories it's like putting a man on the moon. It couldn't be done. And besides, I'd heard all these stories about famous authors, and they were either crazy or they killed themselves. Hemingway shot himself, Sylvia Plath put her head in the oven, Virginia Woolf filled her pockets with rocks and walked into a river. So it really didn't seem like a good career path for a California farm girl. So when it came to decide how I was going to make my living, I still wanted to be a writer, but I opted for practicality and decided I would be a tech writer. My first paid writing gig in the 1970s, early 70s, was a software user manual for a restaurant accounting system. That was followed up by a policy and procedure manual for a biotech lab that covered everything from how to safely handle bloodborne pathogens without getting some dread disease to avoiding sexual harassment in the workplace. Basically, for the first 10 years of my writing career, my job was to take what I thought of as geek speak, legalese, medical, sports talk, academia. That's some of the most geeky, actually, into plain English so that it was available to the general public. And I was pretty good at it, and it was pretty satisfying. And then when I was in my early 30s, my husband challenged me to write the book I was always talking about writing. And when I say challenge, that's being kind. He followed me around making chicken noises at me because I kept saying, I'm not trained, I'm a tech writer. That's creative writing, I don't know how to do it. And finally, to shut him up, I sat down and I wrote my first novel. I did it on 12 yellow legal pads, longhand, because I thought that's the way a real writer would do it. If I could have gotten hold of a quill, I'd have done it that way. As a result of that challenge, though, my first 2 books were published in September and October of 1984 from 2 different publishers. And based on that relatively easy success, the whole process from idea to publication took about 3 years, which is quite a bit less than average. I decided that I was destined to be the next big blockbuster romance superstar. And because of that, I broke the cardinal rule of newly published, which is don't quit the day job. And I dove into writing novels full time. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I need to tell you that I could break that rule of don't quit the day job because I had a husband who had a job that had health coverage, so that I didn't have to worry about not making the rent when the royalty payment was late or it wasn't as big as I thought it was going to be. And just to all you who are thinking about writing, the royalty check is always late, and it's always less than you thought it was going to be. So don't quit the day job, unless you have a spouse who has health insurance. Over the next 10 years, I wrote 17 books for 3 different publishers. And by the end of those 10 years, it became really obvious to me that despite the fact that my books were selling regularly, and I was published in 25 languages, and I'd been on some minor bestseller lists, and I'd won a few prestigious awards, I was not going to be the next superstar romance bestseller. What I was what's known in the publishing world is a solid mid-list author. And that's not a bad place to be. You sell regularly, you make a nice income on the side. My publisher suggested that the way to become a bestseller was to write faster and to increase my output to at least 3 books and preferably 4 books a year. And that way I would garner more readers, which would push up my numbers and push me into bestsellerdom. She said that at that point in my career, it was simply a matter of numbers. The problem with that was that upping my productivity like that would mean I would be spending every waking hour, every day, sitting in front of my computer writing my next book. And that's not how I want to live my life. I love writing. it satisfies me as nothing else does. But I love other things too. And if I'm writing 3 or 4 books a year, I'm not doing anything else. So I took a time out and I reevaluated my goals, and I decided I could be perfectly happy being a tech writer who wrote romance novels on the side. I did not have to be the next romance superstar. So I scaled back to 1 book every 18 to 24 months, and I revitalized my business writing career. And then around 1999, a client approached me about writing a grant proposal. I'd never seen a grant proposal, never written one, didn't know what one is. But my philosophy of writing is that as long as I know the message and I know the audience, I can write anything. So I said, yeah, sure, I'll write it. And I began to lay it out just so I would do any other tech writing project. I got all my facts and my statistics and my demographics, and I wrote all about this project. And the first draft, it didn't work. It was a good idea. It was actually a great idea, but it was flat and uninteresting, and it wasn't convincing. There was nothing in it to move anyone to give great sums of money, let alone $4 million to anybody, which is the $4 million which we were asking for. The problem was, and I'm going to have to amend here because I've heard some really good facts here that would change your mind, but basically, cold, hard facts have never convinced anyone of anything, ever. And despite some of the good statistics we've heard here today, I still believe that. Cold, hard facts alone will not change anybody's mind. You need story to go with those facts. People may use facts and information to back up what they believe, but what they believe is shaped by the story. And good ideas, and that's what grant proposals are good ideas, don't get acted upon or shared just because they are good ideas. You need the power of story, because story is what inspires people to share and to act upon and good ideas. Sad thing is, most people don't know how to tell their story. They try to convince with facts and figures. They marshal their statistics. They use bullet points. People are really fond of bullet points. Those things have their place in a grant proposal and pretty much any kind of writing. You can't write a grant proposal without facts and statistics to back you up. But facts by themselves, as I said, have never convinced anybody of anything. I mean, think about any history class you've ever taken. Do you remember the dates? I don't think. If you're like most people, you don't. But if you were lucky, you had a history teacher who taught you in stories, and you remember those stories. Just like you remember the stories the bad history that you get in movies like Braveheart or Gone with the Wind or The Patriot, stories about people, you remember those, and you think that they're real history. Most of them are not, or they're exaggerated. Stories are what make ideas and facts and figures come to life and stick in your mind, more importantly. And it turns out romance writers are master storytellers. We have to be. The romance market is huge. Depending on which country you're in and which region of the country, romance novels account for 55 to 72% of all fiction sold worldwide. That's a huge market. And that's in spite of the fact that when a woman or a man, but mostly it's a woman, picks up a romance novel, she already knows how it's going to end. The couple is going to get together. So in that market, that big market with those expectations, to be able to hook a reader to buy your book time after time, you really have to be able to tell a good story. So, what is story? The gist of my talk. Story. The first element of story is a goal. To make a story powerful and to make it memorable, you have to provide your reader with a goal. In a romance novel, that's pretty easy. That's finding love, finding a soulmate. In a mystery, or in that CSI episode you watched last week, the goal is to solve the murder and to bring the criminal to justice. In a grant proposal, it might be to eliminate illiteracy. In a sales brochure, the goal is to sell your product. Whatever the goal is, you as the writer have got to make that goal crystal clear. There should be no ambiguity. When somebody reads your piece, they ought to know, what is it you want? What are you trying to tell me? What is the goal? You also have to make it something to be greatly desired. It's not enough to say, this is the goal. You should help me build this building. You should help me increase sales by buying my product. You should buy my book. Why? Why is the goal important? Why is it important? Who will it benefit? What difference will it make? What's it going to change? And most importantly, how will the achievement of that goal affect the reader, their world? What's it going to change for them? The next element of story is emotion. Quite simply, you've got to make people care. You must present your proposal or your idea in a way that your goal becomes their goal. Facts and figures don't evoke emotion. Story does that. There have been laboratory studies done where they hook people up to all these electrodes, and then they show them movies and they read them books. And when we are engaged in story, in powerful story, it affects us physically. It actually, our hearts will start to race, our blood pressure will go up, we may perspire. If Stephen King is telling a story, you're going to get those chills down your back. If you're watching, Freddy Krueger stalk a victim down the staircase to the basement, and you're screaming at the screen, don't go in the basement, and they do it anyway. Or you're sitting there pulling your feet up on the chair because you've got that creepy feeling. The studies show that when you're immersed in story, your brain lights up just as if those things were happening to you. And that's what you want to do in a story, because when you are invested in the story, you remember it. You're persuaded by it, you're changed by it, and hopefully you're going to act upon what you learn from it. The third element, and probably I think the most important element, is establishing a personal connection to the story. You got to give the reader somebody to care about, to identify with, and to root for. In grant writing, it's an axiom that people don't give to organizations, they don't give money to buildings, they give money to people. You've got to make your story full of people. You've got to think of any crowd scene you've ever seen in a movie. So you got this big panoramic crowd scene, and the camera pretty soon focuses in on one or two faces. And you take your cue. If you've already been drawn into the story and you're there, you've been captured, you take your cue on what you're supposed to feel from those faces that you see. A war, the vast and tragic canvas of war, the moviegoer or the director, the writer is always going to focus in on one or two characters, because we cannot identify with the world. We identify with people, individual people. So you've got to put whatever you're talking about, the rivers or the power of no or yes and, put people in it. Give us somebody to identify with. The final thing is rewriting. That's not actually part of craft, but it's technique. The first draft is never the final draft. That's so important, I'm going to say it again. The first draft is never the final draft, ever. You've got to hone your work down to its essence, and you've got to take the time to find the right words. It was Mark Twain who said, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Find the right words, take the time. Do 6 drafts if you have to. I was mentioning to someone, even when I see a finished book, and I get it from my publisher, and I open it up, and I read it, and I look at it, and I think, damn, if they'd given me 2 more days, I could have fixed this. You're always editing. So to give you an example of this grant proposal that I wrote, the first draft that I wrote said, it was a request for low-income senior housing, and I said all the clients served are over 60 years old, 80% have chronic health problems, 50% have mental health problems, 100% of them live below the federal poverty level, and the project that we are proposing will provide these seniors with affordable housing. That's all true. Doesn't touch anyone's emotions. They aren't going to convince anyone to do anything, and as I said, let alone give $4 million. So what if we tell you the story this way? Martha Smith is an 80-year-old widow, and her only son was killed in Vietnam. She lives on her entire income consists of the $600 a month she gets in Social Security. And on this income, she can't afford to pay for her medications for her diabetes or depression. So she cuts her pills in half, or she skips doses, hoping that they're going to do the job. And she can't afford the $700 a month that's the average rent in downtown San Diego. So she spends it tonight in a $10 single-room occupancy hotel where she sleeps in a small room in a single bed behind a dead-bolted door, using a coffee can for a toilet because she's too afraid to go down the hall at night to the single bathroom that serves all the occupants of that floor. And in the morning, she's got to vacate her room. So she puts all her clothing and her medication and her pillow in a garbage bag, or maybe she's got a suitcase, and she goes down to the senior center for her one hot meal of the day. And when she's finished with that meal, if the community room in the senior center is full, she spends her days on the street from park bench to park bench, and maybe in the winter, if she's lucky, she can go into the library to get warm. And the proposed housing project for low-income seniors would provide Margaret with a small studio apartment with her own bathroom. She would have 3 hot, nutritious meals a day in company of other people, not wolfing it down in some senior community center. She would have the medical care she needs to provide for her diabetes in an on-site clinic, therapy sessions to deal with her depression, and the other support services she needs to live in dignity and comfort and security to the end of her days. That story gives you a goal, and the goal is not to build the affordable housing center. The goal is to provide Margaret Schmidt and other people like her with a safe, secure place to live. It provides emotion, because who would not be moved by the thought of an elderly widow who lives in fear and want on the streets? And it provides a personal connection, not some faceless client of a social service organization, but 80-year-old Margaret Schmidt who lives in abject poverty and could be anyone's grandmother. So what approach is more effective? Which helps you see Margaret and the life she lives and the life she could live, and which is more likely to touch your emotions and move you to action? It's the story. It's always the story. That approach is not only for writing grant proposals. I strive to incorporate story into everything I write, whether I'm writing information on somebody's, doing a blog post, or writing a sales collateral, case studies, white papers, probably pretty much anything except software manuals. I have not been able to find a story in a software manual, but I keep trying. Stories, if you take nothing else away from my talk, stories are what make ideas stick and what move people to action. So if you want to influence our communities and bring about lasting change, you must move beyond the cold, hard facts and learn to use the power of story to ignite that change. And I'm here to tell you that you can learn everything you need to know about the power of story by reading a few romance novels.